Hi everyone, welcome back to this AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals training. If this series is helping you learn Azure, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next lessons. In the previous lesson, you learned about core Azure architectural components, regions, availability zones, and resource groups. You saw how Azure is organized physically and logically. In this lesson, we will move one step further and explore the core compute services in Azure. By the end of this video, you will be able to describe 4 important Azure compute options: Azure Virtual Machines, Azure App Service, Containers in Azure, and Azure Functions. You will also understand when to use each option in an AZ-900 exam scenario. Here is what we will cover in this lesson. First, we will review what compute means in the cloud. Second, we will look at Azure Virtual Machines as a flexible infrastructure as a service option. Third, we will learn about Azure App Service for hosting web apps and APIs using Platform as a Service. Fourth, we will discuss containers in Azure and when they make sense. Finally, we will explore Azure Functions and the idea of serverless compute. Let's start with the basic idea of compute. In cloud computing, compute refers to the processing power required to run your applications, services, and workloads. Anytime you run a web application, a background process, an API, or a scheduled job, you are using compute resources. In Azure, compute services come in different abstraction levels, from fully managed platforms to low-level virtual machines. Your choice depends on how much control you need and how much management you want the platform to handle for you. Now, let's start with the most familiar option, Azure Virtual Machines. Azure Virtual Machines, or Azure VMs, are one of the core compute services in Azure. A virtual machine is a software-based computer that runs on top of physical hardware in Azure data centers. With VMs, you can choose the operating system, install custom software, and configure the environment almost like you would in an on-premises server. Azure VMs are a classic infrastructure as a service example. Microsoft manages the physical hardware, the virtualization layer, and the underlying data center infrastructure. You are responsible for managing the guest operating system, installing updates and patches, configuring security at the OS level, and installing and maintaining your applications. Azure offers many VM sizes and families, optimized for different workload types, such as general purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, and specialized workloads like GPU and high-performance computing. You can also use virtual machine scale sets to automatically scale the number of VM instances based on demand. Typical use cases for Azure VMs include migrating on-premises servers to the cloud with minimal changes, running applications that require full control over the OS, hosting workloads that are not easily supported by PaaS or serverless options. In AZ-900 questions, if you see a scenario mentioning lift and shift migration, or a requirement for full control over the operating system, Azure Virtual Machines is often the correct compute choice. Now, let's move to Azure App Service. Azure App Service is a platform as a service offering for hosting web applications, REST APIs, and mobile backends. With App Service, you do not manage the underlying virtual machines. Azure takes care of the infrastructure, the operating system, and many platform features for you. You simply deploy your application code using supported runtime stacks such as .NET, .NET Core, Java, Node.js, Python, and others. Azure App Service provides built-in features such as automatic scaling based on demand, built-in load balancing, integration with Azure Active Directory and other identity providers, continuous deployment integration with tools like GitHub and Azure DevOps. App Service is ideal when you want to focus on application logic instead of managing servers. Typical use cases for Azure App Service include public websites and business web applications, RESTful APIs for mobile or single-page applications, backend services for line-of-business applications, In AZ-900 scenarios, if you see a requirement like host a web application without managing servers, or automatically scale web apps based on traffic, Azure App Service is usually the correct answer. Next, let's talk about containers in Azure. A container is a lightweight, portable unit that packages an application and its dependencies together. Containers share the host operating system kernel, which makes them more resource efficient and faster to start than traditional virtual machines. In Azure, you can run containers in different ways, including Azure Container Instances, ACI, for simple, serverless container runs. Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, a managed Kubernetes service for orchestrating containers at scale. Azure Container Instances are a fast and simple way to run containers without managing servers or orchestrators. You specify the container image, CPU, and memory, and Azure runs the container for you. Azure Kubernetes Service is a more advanced service that provides a managed Kubernetes cluster. It is used when you need to orchestrate many containers, manage scaling, rolling updates, and complex microservices architectures. For the AZ-900 exam, you should understand that containers are useful when you need portability across environments, consistency from development to production, efficient use of resources, modern, microservices-based architectures. In exam scenarios, if you see requirements like containerize applications, use Docker images, or orchestrate many containers, you should think of Azure Container Instances or Azure Kubernetes Service, depending on the complexity. Finally, let's look at Azure Functions. Azure Functions is a serverless compute service. With Azure Functions, you write small pieces of code called functions that run in response to events, such as HTTP requests, messages in a queue, timer-based schedules, changes in data or files. You do not manage servers or virtual machines. Azure automatically handles the infrastructure, scaling, and runtime. In a serverless model like Azure Functions, you are typically charged based on the number of executions, the execution time, and the resources consumed by your functions. Azure Functions is ideal for event-driven workloads, background jobs and scheduled tasks, integrations and automation, short-lived processes that do not need a dedicated server. In AZ-900 questions, if the scenario says something like, run small pieces of code in response to events, or execute code without provisioning or managing servers, the correct answer is often Azure Functions. Let's now compare these four compute options at a high level. Azure Virtual Machines give you the most control over the operating system and environment, but also the most management responsibility. Azure App Service abstracts away the virtual machines and lets you focus on web apps and APIs, providing automatic scaling and many built-in features. Containers in Azure help you package and run applications consistently, either in simple container instances or in orchestrated environments like AKS. Azure Functions gives you a serverless, event-driven model, where you write only the code that matters, and Azure takes care of running and scaling it. In general, as you move from VMs to app service to containers to functions, you trade some control over the environment for more platform automation and simplicity. From an AZ-900 exam perspective, it is important to recognize which compute option fits which type of requirement. Need full OS control or legacy app support? Azure Virtual Machines. Need to host web apps or APIs without managing servers? Azure App Service. Need containerization and portability, possibly with Kubernetes? Container services such as ACI or AKS. Need event-driven, serverless code execution? Azure Functions. If you can map exam scenarios to these patterns, you will be well prepared for compute-related questions in AZ-900. Let's recap what you learned in this lesson. You learned that Azure offers multiple compute services at different levels of abstraction. Azure Virtual Machines for full control with infrastructure as a service. Azure App Service for managed web applications and APIs. Containers in Azure using services like Azure Container Instances and Azure Kubernetes Service. Azure Functions for serverless, event-driven compute. You also saw when to use each option and how to recognize them in AZ-900 exam scenarios. These compute services are a core part of how solutions run on Azure and connect directly to the cloud concepts you learned earlier in this course. If this lesson helped you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to support the content and to follow the next lessons in this AZ-900 series. In the upcoming videos, we will explore Azure storage, networking, and database services in more detail, building a complete picture of the Azure platform for your AZ-900 exam. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.